Hey there, this is Rajiv, and this is my brand new podcast, Photo Country. This is a spin off from my radio show by the same name on the radio station Crescendo FM up in Avondale, Auckland. My first guest on the show is Elton McAleer, a light painting addict turned pro photographer who loves taking headshots with his own spin on it. So, here we go. Hey Elton, thanks for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Glad to be here, Rajiv. How are you?
I'm good. How's Christchurch?
Pretty chilly this morning. Packed the kids off to school, ready for another day of going hard out, trying to set up my new business.
Good. So why don't you give the listeners a brief intro about yourself and your background?
Sure. I've lived in New Zealand 17 years now. And originally from London. I spent some time there working for Getty Images, which is where I really sort of my stripes in not just being a photographer, but trying to understand what makes an image stand out in terms of composition and visual impact, because as you know, they're probably the biggest image library in the world. But photography really after that period has always been a hobby of mine. And once I moved to New Zealand, we had kids after a few years, and really photography for me was a bit of an escape from being a father all the time. Some people might take up golf or football or squash, but when you've got young kids, really the only time I ever had was after they'd gone to bed. And so I found myself, and I've always had an interest in night photography and light painting. I guess I'm a frustrated artist more than a photographer, but I've never really had the skills to be a painter or an illustrator or a graphic designer. But because I'm a techie geek nerd, I found getting into the photography, quite easy. And I've always had a lot of experience in my career my career was in mainly color management and printing and that sort of thing. And the Photoshop is something I've used since probably the mid-90s. So I've always had the skills on the back end, and it just seemed to make sense to really try and, push things with the photography itself. And as I say, that was really an escape for me. Sometimes too much, I'd receive calls from friends, my wife's trying to find me at 4 a.m. in the morning, and I'd be out of phone reach at Wharipu Beach or at Muriwai or Bethel's, lurking in a cave at low tide with the tide creeping in. So I do like the sort of adrenaline buzz that you get from being out in nature, particularly at night. It can be a bit scary at times, but the results are pretty good. So the light painting is something that I'll always enjoy. I've used a pixel stick for quite a few years, which I find a really fun tool, and I've even started doing some animations around that, which really is a labor of love. It's in order to get 1 second of animated pixel stick video, you're looking at 30 seconds per shot, and then walking with the pixel stick during that shot, and obviously use a remote timer. You're probably looking at about 20 minutes shooting for every 1 second of animated pixel stick video because of the length of but the results are really cool, because you can get real life reflections, especially if you do it out at the beach. And I've always had, some good feedback on that pixel stick stuff, which gives you a bit of a point of difference. He's that pixel stick guy. And I like doing the Milky Way stuff as well. And again, I've tried to put a bit of a spin on that. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the multiple exposures I've done of the Milky Way. There's one, if you look up Multiverse, there's maybe I think 15 or 20 of me staring up at the Milky Way, which is something, again, just trying to play with it and have some fun and also keep warm by running around in the dark.
What are your favorite places in Auckland to shoot?
I've always been a big fan of the West Coast. I've never ceased to be amazed at how dark it is out there. Coming from London, you just never find a dark sky. And Auckland's a pretty big city, but you only have to go over the Waitakaris, and a lot of that light pollution is just cut right out. I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, I was up at, I think it's Mount Donald McLean, just the other side of Huia, and there was a big Aurora Australis kicking off, and people could see it from Christchurch. And we even got the sort of pink effects in Auckland, which is pretty cool. And I think that the solar maximum is happening again now. Just looking on Facebook, I saw some people that actually got that same bright pink sky effect in Auckland just last week. And so we're really lucky. It's one of the few big cities in the world where you only have to go half an hour to get dark skies. And not as dark as down in the Mackenzie country, but certainly I've never had any issues shooting the Milky Way in the middle of winter. Especially, I think Wharipu is my favourite place. It's a bit of a drive, and it's 20 minutes down the unmade road to get there, and then a 20-minute walk across the dunes. But certainly the sense of isolation and I think almost spirituality that you feel down at Wharepu is quite magical.
Yes, that's one of my favorite beaches in Auckland as well. It's isolated and it's got quite a feel to it.
Yeah, I was out there again. Maybe it's about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a lunar eclipse, and it probably wasn't the best place to shoot, but it was quite a good night. And the eclipse started happening, and then the clouds sort of came over, and the effect was still pretty good. But after a while, the clouds rolled in, and it had gone from being a full moon you could see for miles. And then the eclipse started happening, it got a bit duller, and then the clouds rolled in. And honestly, it became pitch black to my perception. And it was probably the only time that I've ever been shooting where I really just got scared. And I packed up and left. The stories of the shipwrecks and ghosts at Wharepu started flooding into my mind, and the wind got up, and I just thought, no, I need to go. So, I don't mind getting battered on the rocks by the rolling rogue waves or anything, but I do get the willies sometimes if things change suddenly,
Yeah, so I want to go back to your light painting. So how did that kind of start, and what's your process like? How do you do it?
So there's a few tools. I've always been more into kind of gadgets rather than lenses. I've got a few lenses, but I think for bang for the buck for my images, some of the money I've spent on sort of light painting tools and using fairly standard lenses has been of benefit to me. The main tool I use for light painting is a device by a company called Proto Machines, and I think the model is called the LED2, and it's a handheld torch, effectively, that's very bright. But it's got an LCD screen on the front of it, and it allows you to select the red, green, and blue color that you want. So essentially, you've got 256, if not more, colors, each of which you can make brighter or darker, depending on the type of work that you're doing. And you can program up to 4 or 5 at once. And it's even got a little joystick that will allow you to cycle through the colors. There's some that I've done at Muriwai where I've been standing 100 meters away from the cliffs and putting like a rainbow effect across the cliffs. They're all done in a single exposure, pretty much. And these are the ones where I'm lighting elements of the landscape. Another one I did that one, I think it won I won a People's Choice Award actually up in the Titirangi Gallery, was of the lighthouse up at Wharepu. And I was standing on the tidal flats, so I had a nice reflection with a wide angle lens, and I painted the lighthouse a very vivid blue color. And we had the orange coming from the steelworks behind. And the effect is really stunning, just to be able to pinpoint those elements in the landscape and give them a slightly unusual feel. Again, gives it that slightly magical feel to it. And for people that didn't know that the lighthouse is only maybe 30 meters high, it really looks like a mountain because we've got the wide angle lens and it's pushed a little bit further into the background. I was probably only 100 meters from the lighthouse, but shooting with a 24mm lens, it looked like it was half a mile away and massive. So the idea of just using my normal landscape composition theory, but playing with that a little bit to trick the eye into thinking things are not what they seem is really the key. But in terms of technique, for doing light painting, whether it's painting the landscape or doing imagery in the air, the key really is obviously long exposure. And then with something like the pixel stick or even I spend a lot of money in Kmart on the little $5 fairy lights, for example. And it's quite easy to make quite effective light painting tools. For example, to make the spheres that a lot of people like to do, you can pull out a lot of the bulbs on a meter-long string of fairy lights and put a little weight on the end and then just spin it around. And as long as you're spinning when the camera starts and when the camera stops, you don't get any trail of yourself moving in or out of the picture. But the key really is finding the right aperture so that what you're light painting doesn't blow out the photograph. Because usually something like that, you've not got control of how bright the fairy light is. It's usually a little bit of a trial and error, depending on how dark it is. But typically I'd be doing 30 seconds at probably about f5.6 usually, just so that the light source doesn't burn out, because compared to the surroundings, it's a pretty bright light. And the same with the pixel stick. When I'm walking through the scene, typically I'll do things with the pixel stick like painting. Maybe I should just go into what the pixel stick is very briefly. It's a device that has a little SD card, and you can load any image onto the SD card. And the device itself is a 2-meter long strip of lights that looks like a giant window cleaning squeegee. And you hold it vertically. And you start your exposure and you select the image that you want to paint, and you walk through the scene holding the pixel stick vertically. And essentially it flashes each column of pixels in the image one at a time as you walk. So the faster you walk, the more stretched out your image is, and the slower you walk, the more compressed it is. It's a very bright device, so typically I'll use it on maybe 10% of its strength because I'm in a very dark area. But you can also use it in areas, I've used it down at the viaduct under street lighting, just make it a bit brighter to compensate. But the effect that you get once you've painted your pixel stick is, let's say, for example, I've got a load of phrases, one of which is be free. And you can simply walk through the scene, and once your exposure is taken, the words be free appear in a kind of quite an analog, slightly pixely way, floating in the air. But what makes the image grounded for me in situations like that is if you actually have some water or reflections underneath it. And so you're capturing a moment in time. So it's a digital image that really was in the air, but only one pixel at a time with a real reflection.
Right.
So people really think, how on earth did you do that? Is it a composite? Is this Photoshop work? And having that reflection is almost like your proof that it really happened. Because to do a reflection on a sort of sandy base and it's all higgledy-piggledy, and you would never do that in Photoshop. So
right.
Yeah, that's what makes it a bit unusual. And those images have got good impact. I've sold quite a few prints of just those statements.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely
I think I remember some with the wings and all that you did.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. I've done some angel wings behind people. I sort of gate crashed one of those events. Remember they used to do art in the dark up in, I think, Western Park in Ponsonby?
Right.
Where we have various art installations and thousands of people would go and look at all of the light installations. So I took the pixel stick down there one year and just had a queue of people waiting to get angel wings painted behind them.
Okay, let's talk about what's in your kit bag. So what do you work with?
Okay, so I'm still shooting with an SLR with a mirror. So I'm still on a 6D Canon. It's still the 6D Mark 1. I never went for the 6D Mark 2 because I'm a low light guy, and for the benefits that it had, the feedback really was that the noise was a bit worse than the first one. So for my night painted, my night stuff, trusty old Rokinon or Samyangs. Typically, my go-to lens for night photography is the 24mm. It's a 1.5, which is a slightly unusual aperture. And that's the Samyang. It's the cine version of the lens, which is a little tricky to work with. Often involves blue tack and tape because it's got a declicked aperture. Just repeating the shot and keeping things exactly the same is tricky. But I do find that being able to have that declicked can sometimes be the difference between over and under exposing on the star stuff. And again, it's really good for, I've got a shoulder mounted rig, and for video with a follow focus, you really need that declicked aperture. So that's a real workhorse for me. It's a manual focus, not a particularly expensive lens for me. That the Samyang is all in the glass. They do good lenses. And then the 70 to 200 IS Mark II for portrait work and not so much street photography, but a sort of compressing landscapes down. And I've got a jobbing 24-70, can't remember the brand, and a nifty 50, which if you are out on the street snapping stuff, people don't want a lens right up in their face, and the smaller the lens that you can do for street photography, the better. I think it's just to take away that intimidation that you can cause by having a huge camera.
So let's talk about your career progression. So you worked with Getty Images for a long time. Talk us through your experience there.
At the time when I joined Getty Images, my first role was in the Halton Deutsch Library, which is one of the largest collections of editorial and antique imagery in the world. So they had a lot of glass plate negatives, acetates, silver halide, some rooms that had to be temperature and humidity controlled so that the film wouldn't explode. And I think they had something like 16 million images in the vaults there, physical images, of which they'd only scraped the surface of about 5%. And the people that worked in there were an unusual bunch. They really were. They were virtually part of the library. The system was in their heads, and they'd lived and worked there their whole life. We'd have a list, they'd have an X list of people who might potentially die. And at whatever time of day or night, this team would have to go into the archives and trawl out the historical pictures, whether it was going to be the Queen Mother or various historical figures. And essentially, my role there was to begin the digitization process of all of those archives, which was a successful project. And I ended up moving on to the wider Getty Images organization And I was the digital production manager there. And my role then was to set up and build the scanning department and the retouching department to digitize their core collection of images, which is basically the ones that were sold the most. And I don't know how much your listeners know about how stock imagery has grown and changed over the years. But when I first started, if you wanted a picture of a dog on a beach, you'd phone someone up and they'd say, hello, yeah. And you say, yes, dog on a beach, please. And say, okay, hold on a second. He'd ask you some questions. And within about 2 hours, if you're in London, a courier on a motorbike would turn up with 24 negatives of dogs on beaches in various situations. And you'd choose the one that you wanted and you send the rest of them back. And then you'd take that transparency to a scanning house and you'd get the scan done to the size that you'd paid for. And then that would eventually appear in your magazine with a dog on a beach. And the process was just long-winded. The photographers liked it because there was a higher conversion rate for the images because you weren't trawling through so many. But the actual expense of not just purchasing a stock image for use, but then producing it in your printed matter was huge. And we'd have collections all around the world. You know, these basically suitcases and flight cases full of transparencies. I remember we would repeatedly have to send the core collection over to countries like Bolivia or Nicaragua, and they'd say, oh no, we need the collection again. Bandits have stolen it. There was tales that virtually modern day highwaymen had held up the courier and taken the whole collection. In reality, someone had probably just sold it. But yeah, it was reasons like this. And obviously the expense of making all of these multiple transparencies for every single image on this and only selling 10% of them was really prohibitive. And so the decision was made, along with the rest of the world, to start digitizing and selling online, which presented its whole raft of problems and challenges, most notably in the early days from the photographers, because these were the days, remember, when you would never put your real name on the internet. You'd be Nerf Blaster 69. To reveal who you really were on the internet would be professional suicide. And so I'd have photographers phoning up and saying, no, my images are going on the internet over my dead body. They would never want their images to be on the internet because it was just a free-for-all. And there was just in the days where before credit card online, and you just would never put real personal information in. So that was a big challenge, getting those photographers on side. And then, of course, the next challenge is that if you bought it as a magazine editor or an art director, all you needed to do was choose the picture, and the industry that's pretty much disappeared, the repro graphics industry, would sort out getting that image from a transparency to being on a magazine page or in a book. And so all of a sudden we're trying to sell a finished product to an industry that had no idea what to do with it. They were expecting a CMYK file to put in their Quark Express or InDesign. And I don't know if your listeners know much about the print process, but there's no such thing as a single CMYK file that will work on multiple printing processes. A newspaper image has to be prepared very differently to a magazine image, for example. And so that was really what led me into my core sort of skills of color management, which was trying to advise customers what they would do with this RGB image in order to get it to work on their press, because an RGB image is an asset that you can use on all different printing processes. And so I really had to cut my teeth on learning color management. And that's really what got me into color management as a consultant, which I did for several years after Getty Images, which was being that missing link between the art and design sector and the printing press.
So what prompted your move from being a color management consultant in the print world to now pursuing photography as a profession?
I guess that's really down to the changing world, really, the move online. I ran a color management business for about 4 years out of an office in Glen Eden, and I had a fairly good customer base, but one by one, a lot of those print companies either consolidated into bigger print companies, and one of the main services I would offer would be to calibrate the presses and calibrate the monitors and the inkjet printers so that everything looked the same. And when I started that process, the proofing part of printing was still really important. The ad agencies that I would work with, like Saatchi and FCB, they really would always want to see the proofs before the job would go on the press, and the brands would sometimes want to see the proofs. But as the printing world changed, there became more and more automation, less of a requirement, and also perceived, in my opinion, a change in the quality threshold that was required, because as the print product became less important, the quality control around it either got automated or was not of as much interest to the buyer, because their focus was shifting towards online commerce, as the shift. And so really it was up to me to work out where that was going to go in terms of what content and what was going to stay viable. And moving back up the line towards photography was really the way to go for me in terms of staying involved in a similar industry and using the skills that I had developed over the years. So that business I closed down in 2016, 2017. And we moved to Christchurch a couple of years ago, and I quickly got involved in an imaging company down here, which was providing a similar service to Getty, but more to government organisations. So we were scanning things like Antarctic diaries and museum pieces and old books and plans and maps and things like that to a pretty high-end level. And so in a lot of ways, it was still very close to what I've done in terms of repro and scanning. But again, scanning itself has died, and now 90% of those places are using cameras. So it was really, that's pretty serendipitous for me that I could combine that work experience with my love of cameras, and using phase ones every day was a dream for me.
In today's world, when technology is so democratized because of the availability of so many different cameras at different price points, right? So you have a wide range of SLRs, mirrorless for every type of photographer out there. Becoming a professional photographer at this point in time, is it difficult or is it challenging? Like how do you differentiate yourself?
Good question. And maybe ask me again in 6 months and we'll see if the business has been a success. But I would never want to bag my fellow photographers, because I love looking at people's images. But I think that there's a very clear difference to me between being a photographer and running a photography business. And that's where I'm really going to try to put my initial focus. We're starting this venture really without much capital behind us. I'm using kit that I've already got. But when I look at what the competition are doing, and there are some that are doing things very well, but typically a photographer's website will be full of great images, and often seeming to wanting to be all things to all people with a little message. Get in touch if there's anything that I can help you with. Whereas just from running my own business, I've learned over the years that you really need to target a niche and market aggressively to that niche. Know who your ideal customer is. One of the great things about running your own business is that you can choose who you want to work with and what you want to provide them. And the rule of business number one is that what problem are you going to solve for your customers? And over the recent years, I've always had an eye for doing really quite, I suppose, eye-catching street photography style headshots of people. And when you look through LinkedIn, it sometimes still feels a little stuffy. People have got I have nothing against Pete Hurley style, but to me, that's a bit blue steel. It's a little forced sometimes. And I know that a lot of my peers, and I'm getting on a bit, but I think a lot of certainly the younger generation I can speak to, they do not want to have that corporate tie suited headshot, because that's not who they are. That's not what their business is. And that's not the image that their business wants to promote. And so by attacking the niche of the slightly younger, still professional, but especially in this day where people are working from home, approachable and more relaxed style of corporate photography, I think that there's something that that can work for me if I promote it and market it correctly. And so really it's not so much about how good a photographer I am, but why I'm doing it. It's all about, you may have seen the famous TED talk about selling from the inside out. The Apple thing is like why we do it, not what we do. By the way, do you want to buy a computer? I'm really trying to follow that pattern, make myself relatable, help people understand why they're going to have a relaxed, fun time doing it and what problem I'm going to solve for them. And by the way, they're going to get some great headshots out of it. And so by building that customer base, that should, I hope, allow me to sell more things to the same people, which is always easier than trying to sell one thing to lots of people. Right. So, that's my business model in a nutshell, and we'll see how it goes. I'm trying to learn from mistakes that I've made in the past and really just try to offer a service that people are going to want and people are going to enjoy.
So is this only in Christchurch, will you travel around doing stuff? Yeah. Any last thoughts, Elton? What do you want to somebody who's getting into photography or is thinking of getting into a sort of semi-professional weekend warrior kind of a guy. Do you have any message?
I think that my one takeaway for people would be to really follow your passion to find your style and something that's going to be the point of difference. As much as we can all want to get a great photo of the Wanaka tree, we've all seen the Wanaka tree. Show us something we haven't seen before. Show us your personality in photography, and that's what's going to make people remember you. Not a great photo of something you've seen before, but something that causes people to stop and think, that's a bit unusual. I'm going to find out some more about this guy, this girl.
So, Elton, where can people find you online? Do you have a website, or how can people reach out to you?
Yeah, sure. The website is currently live for the business, and that is www, and it's a bit of a long one, .eltonmacaleerphotography.com. And that's McAleer spelt MCALEER. But I guess if you Google Elton Photography Christchurch, I should be up there if I've done my work.
And what's your Instagram handle?
It's Elton McAleer as one word. And the same on Twitter and Facebook. All my profiles are public. Yeah, if anyone wants to reach out and get in touch, always glad to help.
Awesome. That's good to hear, Elton. Thanks for that. Thanks, Elton, for coming on the show. So that's a wrap on the first episode. As always, like, comment, and share this podcast. I will be dropping one episode every week, or at least I will try to. So till next time, keep clicking.